Sometime in mid-1999, I sat in Sky City Cinema watching a festival screening of a terrifying Japanese film. During many of the scenes, I kept telling myself, don't freak out, it's only a movie. It was a new kind of terror that I felt watching it. It was different from the jump scares and gore I was used to in Hollywood horror. Later, I woke up in the middle of the night, still shivering from the experience and couldn't get back to sleep. The film was called Ringu, and it is the most famous of what would be called the J-horror films. It was preceded by a few notable examples of this fresh type of approach to scaring an audience, but nothing quite managed to have the success of Ringu and spawn as many remakes, sequels, and spin-offs. J-horror is a sort of journalistic shorthand for this group of films that came out in Japan in the late 90s and early 2000s. The films all shared slow burn, terrifying stories, hints of the supernatural, and when they did reveal their ghosts and monsters, they did so in a way that was strikingly scary. The film's ultimate goal is to fill the audience with unshakable osore, or terror, or fear, a word that can be translated both ways. This new wave of scary cinema from Japan seemed unprecedented at the time to me. But as I want to talk about this evening, there were some important precursors. In Hollywood, the same year Ringu was released, a lot of the main horror releases were sequels like I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, The Prophecy 2, Bride of Chucky, and Halloween H20. And there was also a remake of Godzilla, the most famous Japanese kaiju monster. Some of these are fun, scary films, but there isn't anything particularly fresh or new amongst the list, and nothing that kept me awake after watching. Ringu felt very different to me. There was only a couple of jump scares, there was no gore, and a ghost, as we can see on the screen here, Sadako, whose face is covered by her long, thick hair. The most we get to see of her in a shockingly extreme close-up is one enraged eye. The story used what felt like ancient relics of ghost stories, a curse, an avenging ghost, and characters trying to uncover the truth about the mysterious twisted history of the ghost. These folkloric elements were combined with what was then modern technology, the videotape, and it was set in late 90s Japan. I loved this blend of classic ghost story ideas with the modern world. It gave the terror a more immediate, visceral feel. I will just say the moments where we encounter Sadako are more terrifying and memorable because of the carefully plotted, slow build and tension that runs throughout the movie. I will now attempt a brief summary, mostly spoiler-free, of the plot of Ringu. Reiko Asakawa, a TV journalist, is attempting to solve the death of her niece, who, along with 3 of her friends, has died suddenly of a heart failure after experiencing a massive shock. As part of her investigations, Asakawa is exposed to a videotape with a collection of eerie, bizarre images on it that are also clues to its origin. Once she has finished watching, she gets a phone call that tells her that she will die in 1 week. As she gets further into the mystery, she and her ex-husband, Ryuji Takayama, who watches the video as well, discover the tragic story of Sadako, a powerful psychic able to will people dead, who was cruelly murdered and thrown into a well. They come to realize it is Sadako's ghost, who will appear at the exact time they watch the video in 7 days. Asakawa and Takayama travel to the spot where Sadako was murdered, with the hope of giving Sadako a proper burial to lift the curse. And I won't say any more because the ending is all the more powerful for not knowing it's coming. And I encourage you to experience it for yourself. After the success of The Ring, there was a deluge of J-horror releases. There was another classic of the genre, The Grudge, in 2004, Hypnosis, Doppelganger, Pulse, Seance, and Nakata's second J-horror classic, Dark Water. I want to look at what Ringu and many of the other J-horror films have in common with a much older tradition of ghost stories in Japan that predate horror cinema and cinema itself. Up until this point, I have been using the phrase J-horror a lot. I'm not sure it's quite right to describe the uniqueness of these films or the type of sustained terror or fear that they bring out in an audience. Horror is certainly associated with creepiness and terror, but also with jump scares, gore, and violence that most of these films had very little, if any, of. Horror was coined to describe a type of Hollywood film made in the 30s and has come to be associated since globally with gore, violence, and monsters. I think these films from the late 90s and early 2000s show the influence of the kaiki eiga tradition in Japanese cinema that came of age in the late 50s, but had been around since the dawn of the silent era. They blend elements of kaiki eiga with other films made throughout the cinematic age from the UK and the US. The word kaiki can be very roughly translated as weird, strange, or bizarre. Kaidan is used to refer to a strange, bizarre, or weird literature, or the strange and bizarre in kabuki theater. Kabuki stories were designed to create osore. Again, we hear this word for terror and fear in the audiences as warnings about the price of committing sins. Their penalty was karmic retribution that even Buddha wouldn't save you from. Kaito Genso, or the weird and fantastic, was an established subgenre by the Heian period, which ran from 794 until 1185. But it was during the Edo period that went from 1603 until 1867, when technology made access to literature possible and Kaidan theatre and literature became much more popular. A well-off merchant class with time to read and entertain with ghost stories led to the explosion in their popularity. During this period, the Night of 100 Ghost Stories became a popular tradition that continues to this day in some areas of Japan. This takes place during the hot, humid summer months in Japan during the Obon Festival, which is a festival to commemorate the dead ancestors. The idea is that telling a scary ghost story will give you a chill to cool you down. Kabuki Kaidan were performed during the festival as well. One of the best known kabuki from the Edo era is Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan, or the ghost story of Yotsuya, which is still performed to this day. Written by Tsuruya Namboka IV in 1825, it was inspired by a series of gruesome murders. As the story goes, there is a viciously cruel samurai Imon who deceives Oiwa, the daughter of a man he has murdered, into marrying him. When Oiwa is disfigured by a jealous rival for her husband's love, Imon rejects her. Oiwa, in her grief, dies by accidental suicide, but she returns as an avenging ghost to haunt, and eventually, after many twists and turns, drive Imon to madness. The avenging ghost, or Shiro, is a common theme of many of the most popular kabuki kaidan. Another of the most famous kabuki kaidan, Bancho Sarayashiki, or the Dish Mansion at Bancho, features Okiko, an avenging ghost who rises from a well that she was thrown into to torment her killer. Equally as famous to the avenging ghosts in kaidan is the Bakaniko, or ghost cat. Like Oiwa and Okiku, the ghost cat is an omnipotent and unstoppable force in traditional kaidan, targeting wicked characters who must face karmic retribution for their crimes. as we have seen, Kaidan Kabuki was part of the very beginning of cinema. With the opening up of Japan to the West in 1868, what is called the Meiji era, many traditions, including Kaidan-themed kabuki, were discouraged by a regime keen to appear modern and progressive. Dismissed as crass and primitive forms of entertainment, more traditional Kaidan kabuki were relegated to smaller kabuki companies. For the bigger, more popular kabuki troupes, Kaidan elements were downplayed or revised to have psychological explanations for ghosts or ghost cats, or were completely written out of the story. With the birth of cinema and the formation of studios looking for subject matter, the smaller, more traditional kabuki troupes could supply actors cheaply who brought with them well-rehearsed Kaidan material. The bigger companies had no interest in the sideshow entertainment that early cinema represented. Sadly, most of the cinema from this time has been lost, and we're left with only a few scraps, a few short sequences from a handful of films. To portray the ghosts and ghost cats, these early silent films used techniques such as double exposure, reverse filming, and stop motion. Story was often secondary. The goal was to thrill the audience, to dazzle them with the amazing new technology. Critics called these silent Kaidan adaptations trick films or illusion films. They complained that the films were not scary and simplistic trick photography. Instead, they embraced films set in the modern world that employed what they believed to be more sophisticated techniques learned from non-Japanese cinema. It's difficult to know how audience reacted, but for a while at least, trick films were around until the mid-20s in what was a burgeoning film industry in Japan, and were able to compete with ninja, samurai, and modern day set films. By the mid-20s, some other way of amazing and hopefully scaring the audience was needed. It was around this time, too, that cinema from outside Japan began to influence and be assimilated into the film culture. In 1931, Universal Studios released Dracula starring Bela Lugosi. It signaled a new kind of experience for Western moviegoers that they weren't quite prepared for. Some may have remembered important precursors like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Nosferatu, or some of the older films that dealt with the darker side of human nature. But these were standalone films that were marketed as art films, dark romances, or mysteries. Universal tried to market Dracula as a mystery or a dark romance, and critics felt were stumbling over words to try and describe it. Some described it as having an eerie atmosphere and a creepy horror. But the phrase horror film would come later in 1931 after the release of Frankenstein. In Japan, though, critics knew exactly how to describe what they were watching. In Kinema Jumpo Film Magazine, the critic Murakami Hisao wrote, "Now this is something novel these days, a mysterious kaiki eiga that deals with vampires." And later in the review, he praises Todd Browning for successfully creating a kaiki atmosphere that captures hold of the audience's heart. It was around this time that the phrase kaiki eiga was becoming more widely used by critics and in promotional material for films as well. Both characters in the word kai and ki means strange, bizarre, or weird. It was a phrase that captured the creeping horror or terror in Dracula and Frankenstein, and something that critics believed had eluded homegrown films so far. The growing international appeal of horror would influence Japanese filmmakers eventually, but native filmmakers didn't just copy, they integrated the ideas into their own storytelling techniques. Some of the influence can be seen in the next wave of films for thrill-seeking audiences, the vamp film. The vamps were actresses expert at playing beautiful, seductive, but deadly characters. The most popular vamp, you can see here, Suzuki Sumiko, was famous for portraying ghost cats and also appeared in numerous productions of the ghost story of Yotsuya as Oiwa. Suzuki was the first Kaigi Eiga superstar, and although critics once again complained that her films were not scary enough, audience turned up in huge numbers to see them. Some Kaigi Eiga aspired to be more sophisticated and present more ambiguous interpretations of the Kaigi elements in the story. Just as Kabuki with Kaidan stories had been influenced by the Meiji era attitudes, these films attempted a more modern version of the story. In The Ghost Cat and the Mysterious Shamasan, Suzuki Sumiko plays against type a Kabuki actress villain called Mitsui, who is haunted by the ghosts of a woman and a cat she murders early in the story. In a breathtaking finale, Suzuki's character is terrorized on stage by these spirits. But there is a layer to the sequence which allows the audience to interpret the avenging spirits not just as supernatural avenging beings, but as manifestations of Mitsui's guilt. Edgar Allan Poe used a similar approach in his stories, which were incredibly popular in Japan at the time. This led to many traditional kaidan being revised to express psychological explanations for ghosts, ghost cats, or demons. The film has some genuinely creepy moments, and even if it doesn't sustain a sense of osore, there are many worthwhile moments in it, and it can be found quite easily on YouTube. Many of the Kaiki Eiga stuck with traditional formulas. It was common at this time to blend Kaiki Eiga with ninja pictures and end the film with a final fight between ninjas or samurais and ghost cats or other worldly avenging spirits. Many years later, Ringu screenwriter Takahashi Hiroshi would complain that the pre-war versions of Yotsuya Kaidan were little more than spook houses full of gimmicks. The true potential of Kaiki Eiga, in his opinion, had yet to be realized in cinema. They lacked the creeping, sustained terror that would make them truly effective Kaiki Eiga. Both during and after the war, Kaiki Eiga were for very different reasons put on a blacklist of film genre that were deemed undesirable. During wartime, the Japanese government called for national policy films, deeming Kaiki primitive. Foreign Kaiki was severely limited in release and eventually banned in the outbreak of the war. In occupied post-war Japan, local films with themes of karmic retribution were banned by the Supreme Command of the Allied Forces. Films with positive messages of people living together in peace were encouraged. These attitudes were maintained by the incoming post-occupation civil censorship detachment that encouraged films on desirable subjects, such as Japanese from all walks of life cooperating to build a peaceful nation. The only Kaiki Eiga of this era, from 1947, was a much altered version of the ghost story of Yotsuya, subtitled A New Interpretation. All the traditional Kaiki elements were vacuum cleaned from the story. A silent Oiwa makes only a brief appearance, easily read by the audience as a manifestation of Imon's torment. The film has the flavor more of a tragedy with elements of psychological thriller. In the late 50s, the rise of films like Godzilla released in 1953, were an attempt to modernize kaiki aiga and take it out of the old world and into the world of contemporary Japan. Science fiction horror also flourished, looking to the unknown of outer space for new forms of terror. Pre-World War II, there had been at least 29 adaptations of the ghost story of Yotsuya, but during the late 40s and early 50s, it seemed that Oiwa was destined to be a relic of older times. It wasn't until 1959 that Oiwa returned to the cinema. Actually, two versions of Yotsuya were released this year. One, a color remake of A Ghost Story of Yotsuya, a new interpretation, has long been forgotten. The other, for which we've just watched the trailer, directed by Nakagawa Nobuo, is considered one of the great masterpieces of kaiki cinema. The vengeful, relentless Oiwa is for the first time in full color, shot in widescreen with care and time taken over set, lighting, and costume design, not to mention fantastic performances from the cast. And most importantly, a sustained mood of terror runs through the film. This adaptation adheres closely to the most central aspects of traditional kaiki and departs in others. Oiwa has become once again the unstoppable avenging ghost central to the story. Aimon, the cruel husband, quickly betraying his wife so that he may advance his position in the world. The original Kaidan text contained many subplots and examples of worldly evil visited on the characters. Nakagawa's version streamlines the plot and focuses on the betrayal of Oiwa and the cruelty of Aimon. Aimon doesn't exhibit remorse for his cruelty. In other versions, he is more guilt-ridden. His character is a stoic killer, constantly looking for ways to advance in society, and without hesitation, he murders those who trust him most. But against Oiwa's fury, he is completely helpless. Nobuo's Yotsuya illustrates one of the main aspects of kaiki aiga, what H.P. Lovecraft called cosmic fear. Essential to this is, in his words, a certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of the outer unknown forces must be present. There is no protection for Aimon in Nakagawa's Yotsuya. As he retreats to a temple for solace, a statue of Buddha recedes into darkness, leaving him to his fate. There will not even be spiritual protection for Aimon. Oiwa doesn't engage with Aimon through a fight scene, as would have been standard for pre-war versions of the story. Instead, it is suggested through quick editing and montage techniques that she is everywhere at once and completely inescapable. Nakagawa's interpretation allows for a possible psychological reading of Oiwa as a manifestation of Aimon's guilt, but ultimately it is left up to the audience to decide. The popularity of this version led to a boom for kaiki aiga that lasted until the end of the decade, when the rise of TV began to affect the box office. Outside of Japan, two films made during this decade, The Innocents from 1961 and The Haunting from 1963, were incredibly important to would be incredibly important to the future generation of J-horror filmmakers. Both films manage a sustained airiness and restraint at revealing their ghosts. The Haunting particularly never shows its ghost on screen. Sound, actors' performances, and clever shot choices create a sustained mood of terror in the film. The Innocents, adapted from Henry James's Turn of the Screw, does more to reveal its spooks, but there is always a level of ambiguity to the appearance of the ghost. As with The Haunting, the apparitions may just be in the minds of the main characters. This incredibly eerie scene features a ghost appearing to the main character in broad daylight and just out of focus. By the 70s, audiences had changed and studios began releasing films aimed at just male audiences with exploitation and crime themes. The Obon Festival timed releases of traditional ghost stories moved from the cinema to TV in the 70s as well. Strands of kaiki aiga could be found in some of the films of this period, but they are faint. Eroticism and violence were heightened in stories where they were once subtle, hinted at themes. By the late 70s and early 80s, the word kaiki had long faded from usage. During the 80s and early 90s, horror, HRA, was used to describe these films that were a local blend of terror and gore influenced by Hollywood. The director of Sweet Home would undergo a transformation himself in the late 80s and be closely aligned with the more subtle approach of the younger generation. This younger generation of filmmakers were looking to the past for inspiration. They weren't so interested in extreme over-the-top violence. Rather, they were inspired by films like The Haunting and The Innocents and some of the older kaiki that created terrifying moments, such as Nakagawa's Yotsuya. As I sat in the cinema watching Ringu, almost cacking myself with fear, telling myself, don't freak out, it's only a movie, I was simultaneously excited about seeing something fresh and original. But this wasn't the first kaiki type of film Ringu director Nakata Hideo had attempted to make. His film Ghost Actress was released in '96, which was also his first collaboration with screenwriter Takahashi Hiroshi, who would have a major influence on some key elements of Ringu. Takahashi argued that it would be much scarier in Ghost Actress if the ghost's face was never shown. Nakata had in Ghost Actress wanted to make a more traditional Kaidan style movie, he said, and wasn't quite convinced. This approach is what Gore Verbinski took in his American remake of Ringu that, in my opinion, dilutes the impact of his Sadako, who's called Samara. After the muted audience response that Ghost Actress received, Nakagawa was more willing to try Takahashi's approach for their next project together, Ringu. The film breaks with the long tradition of revealing the ghost either at the end of the film or a key point in the story. Takahashi has since outlined 6 key ideas for what might be used for portraying a ghost on screen. Number 1, don't show the face of the ghost and only show a fragment of the body, or put the ghost in a long shot so the face is blurred, as can be seen in The Innocents. 2, make the standing position or behavior unnatural. 3, make its movement non-human. 4, put the body in an impossible position. 5, if you have to show the face, make it sure it truly terrifies. 6, or show nothing. Takahashi specifically mentions The Haunting as a perfect example of this technique. Ringu is not set in a universe where vengeful spirits target only those who have wronged them, as was typical of traditional Kaidan. Sadako turns her rage outwards to anyone who is unlucky enough to watch the cursed video. Her rage continues in an endless cycle. As in Nakagawa's ghost story of Yotsuya, there is no escape from the ghost through intervention from a priest or any other spiritual means, nor is there relief for Sadako herself, who is cursed to exact revenge eternally. A heavy dread hangs over the film, just the kind of slow-burning, eerie feeling that can be experienced in the ghost story of Yotsuya. Traditional kaiki, historical Edo period settings are replaced in Ringu with contemporary urban settings. Most kaiki up until its demise in the late 60s were shot within completely or partially on studio sets. This gave it a distinct otherworldly feel, as did the exotic feel of Edo period settings. This is replaced instead with ordinary houses and public spaces in the J-horror films. Nakata mentions his choices for some of the locations where he specifically wanted an eerie quality they would bring to the story. In talking about Oshima Island, where some of Ringu's scenes are filmed, he comments on the very bad or unnatural feeling that inspired him to shoot there. Even traditional spaces such as washitsu rooms, Nakata believes can be very dark and have an eerie aspect in themselves. There is no karmic justice in Ringu. Even more so than Nobua's Yotsuya, spiritual protection is not possible for the characters. Asakawa's psychic cynically jokes that she should go and get an exercise by a priest to lift the curse Sadako has placed on her. But it is never a serious consideration. The rational, level-headed Asakawa uses all her resources, along with the psychic abilities of Takayama, to unravel the mystery of Sadako's death. But this is not enough. There is no transcendent moment when Sadako will be freed to ascend to heaven, as Oiwa does in the final moments of Nakagawa's Yotsuya. This is close to H.P. Lovecraft's concept of cosmic fear, a chaotic, unknowable universe where karmic justice just doesn't exist. So far, there have been 6 sequels to the original Ringu. In 2019, Sadako, the 6th and possibly last film in the series, given its dismal reception, to deal with this version of the Vengeful Ghost was released. But Sadako is now part of popular culture and international horror culture, and was recently added as a villain to Dead by Daylight, the online horror game. As far as movies go, for a while at least, it seems like Oiwa and Sadako and their sisters are sleeping again, waiting for a fresh approach to bring them back to the cinema. I wouldn't want to bet against any of them not shaking me to my core again in the future. There are hints of a return, as in 2020's Shirai-san or Stare, that is a blend of Kaiki Eiga with modern horror ideas that demonstrate that it might be still a potent way of scaring. These might still be a potent way of scaring people. Shirai-san features curses, an unstoppable ghost, and slow building tension. It also throws exploding eyeballs into the mix too. I would like to finish with a reading of a shortened version of one of the stories that, although it may not have been a direct influence on Ringu, must certainly have been in the minds of the filmmakers. This is the ghost story of Dish Mansion, or Bansho Sarayashiki. A long time ago in the town of Bansho, there was a beautiful woman named Okiku. Her master was a samurai named Aoyama, and he fell deeply in love with her. Every day he would ask her to be his mistress, but she always refused his advances, preferring the life of a servant to the life of a concubine. Eventually, Aoyama made his final advance on Okiku, but again she refused, so Aoyama decided to trick her. He hid one of his family's best dishes, which, as a servant, Okiku was supposed to be in charge of. When Okiku was counting the dishes later, she noticed that there were only 9 instead of 10. She counted and counted again, but each time only came up with 9. Okiku panicked, as losing one of these valuable objects would mean quite literally her life. She fell into despair. She went to her master in tears to confess she had lost one of the dishes. All part of this plan, of course, Aoyama told her that he would be gracious enough to overlook the problem if she agreed to be his lover. Okiku refused, and Aoyama grew enraged. He threw her down a well, and she died. After her death, it is said that Okiku became a vengeful Japanese ghost. She tormented her master by counting and counting from 1 to 9, and then shrieking a horrible scream. Aoyama was finally able to exorcise her ghost by having another servant wait until she reached number 9 and then suddenly shout 10. After that, it is said that Okiku stopped haunting him, but the story doesn't end there. Where she went next is unknown, but there are tales of Okiku all over Japan. It is said that she appears crawling out of a well and counts, ever searching for her missing 10th plate. Anyone who hears her count all the way up to 9 will die.